Hey, thanks very much for inviting me to talk today. I just would start with this next one. There we go. When I was a youngster, I used to get sent to my grandmother's house when my parents wanted a break. And my grandmother's house was rather devoid of anything interesting. There were three things in the house that you could entertain yourself with. One was an old piano, which was out of tune, and also my grandmother was very, very old school, and children were to be seen and not heard, so the piano was out. And then there were two sets of books. One was a set of Bibles and psalm books and what have you, and the other was Encyclopedia Britannica. So my influence from my grandmother, I was either going to end up being an encyclopedia salesman or a preacher. But luckily, being attracted to the Britannicas, I became fascinated by just looking through the books, and I'm sure it had a big influence on me becoming interested in science. And this picture here is a classic marine food chain picture, which is very much, it's old school, and it's very much influenced the way that people see the marine environment and actually perceive it. And you see different versions of it, and typically it's got seabirds sitting on the top and whales swimming around on the surface. And those are often the things that we focus on, because unless you can get under the water, you can't see them. And so here's in the Gulf News, 6 blue whales spotted over the summer in the Hauraki Gulf. A lot of excitement about seeing these animals, which are top of the food chain. And it's the less well-known things that sit down on the seafloor that are actually important, often in some ocean food chains. And we know that now. And in the inner Hauraki Gulf particularly, last century, green-lip mussels were absolutely critical to the ecosystem. There were huge beds of mussels, over 500 square kilometres. So that's an area bigger than the size of metropolitan Auckland. So you can imagine it's like having a tropical forest on the seafloor, and we took it away. And they're incredibly important in terms of filtering, their filter feeding process, as you heard from Stephen Riley, filtering large quantities of water every day and extracting out that productivity that's from the sunlight and taking it down to the seafloor. And if you think about a blue whale, which is the largest animal ever to live on Earth, well, it's the same as, 40 elephants and 2,667 people? Well, it's less than 1/100th of a square kilometre of mussels, and we had over 500 square kilometres of mussels. So you work that out, and that's roughly 50,000 blue whales sitting on the seafloor of the Hauraki Gulf, feeding on the productivity. And that's all being taken down to the seafloor. And so we've got a whole completely different ecosystem to what's there now. And here's a map of the Gulf from last century, and you can see large areas of green-shell mussels, particularly along in the inner Firth, totally removed. So we have totally obliterated this ecosystem by removing one of the key elements of productivity in this ecosystem. And here's the culprits: a small group of fishing boats using heavy steel dredges. You can see it here, just dragged along the seafloor and just ripped up the carpets of mussels off the seabed, and they basically were no longer able to replace themselves. The mussels were taken to the wharf in Auckland and put in sacks, and Aucklanders basically ate their way through the lot, which is quite remarkable. In fact, I had a meeting yesterday with someone in Maharangi yesterday, and they were telling me about how they used to work in the city. When he was a kid, worked in the family firm, which was a laundry service, and every Friday he was sent down to the wharf to get some bags of mussels, and they'd bring them up and put them in the washing machine, in the steaming washing machine, and steam the mussels, and then they'd have a bit of a feed of mussels with some beers on Friday night for work. So it was a big part of the Auckland tradition, but it had a major impact on the environment. So there's the fishing history. This is the kind of thing we give in stage 1 fisheries classes, boom and bust. Basically, they fished the beds out completely. And the market in Auckland was so strong that the boats looked around for somewhere else. And so they found there were mussel beds in the Marlborough Sounds, and so the boats all went down there and did exactly the same thing all over again, obliterated the beds in the Marlborough Sounds and in Tasman Bay. And then they moved north up the west coast and started on the beds in the Manukau Harbour and Kaipara. But luckily by then, people had worked out how to start farming mussels, and so farm mussels were a much better product, and they were replacing the wild mussels in the Auckland market. So it saved the last of those west coast beds. And it may be coincidence, but this is some data from NIWA, and here's the mussel catch in the Hauraki Gulf going up until it collapsed, finished, when the fishery ended. And at the same time, a number of fish species in the Hauraki Gulf went down. And it's probably no coincidence, because mussel beds are particularly important in terms of providing a nursery and feeding area for juvenile fishes, especially those fishes which live on the seafloor, such as snapper. And here's an example from 1963. It was published in the New Zealand Herald, where 3,000 snapper were caught by 48 fishers in, 4 hours, and that's just in Rangitoto Channel, just out of Auckland Harbour. So this is the boat coming back into Auckland. You can see the snapper all lined up around the boat. They're all large snapper. We don't see that now. I think if you went out and had that fishing trip, you'd definitely think something was wrong. And it wasn't just taking mussels off the seabed. We've had a tremendous impact on the seafloor in other ways. So when Captain Cook arrived 2 centuries ago, he sailed up the Waihau River. He needed some spars for the boat, and kahikatea trees were the perfect for making spars because they're long, straight, and very strong and resistant to salt water. When he sailed up that river, it was crystal clear, and because the water was being filtered by the vast swampland that was the Hauraki Plains. But since then, we've cleared the land in a very rough way, often. So this is Thames during the gold rush period. Dairy farming's come in a big way. We felled the forest. And the Hauraki Plains, we got rid of the swamp, which filtered the water. And you can see the impact that that's had. And you can see the chocolate colour of the Waihau River now. And you can see what it's doing to the Hauraki Gulf. At the time, people said at the turn of the previous century, people said the Hauraki Plains could not be farmed because it was too hard, and most of the drainage channels were initially dug by hand. And when they realised how successful it was and how fertile the land that was recovered was, it rapidly, most of the plains were drained. And this is just a simple photo I flew over recently and you can see the Waihau River emptying out. And this area along here is a series of pictures from there, and you can see 30 years ago it was sandy white beach, and now it's 500 metres, almost a kilometre of mud with mangroves, and that's just dirt coming off the land and ending up on the seafloor and gradually building up. So this is what the seabed of the Hauraki Gulf looks like now in most parts. It's fine, silty mud, and it's very difficult for organisms to establish on there. Things like mussels haven't come back in the 50, 60 years since we crashed the fishery. There's still some small patches of mussel beds around, but they're struggling in terms of extending. Why are mussel beds important? Well, they are remarkably productive because of that ability to filter out the production out of the water. They pull it down to the seafloor and they make that available for other organisms. So associated with mussel beds, you get 4 times mobile critters, little things like crabs, snails, worms, starfish, all the things that baby fish and fish like to eat. You get 10 times more small and juvenile fishes, and that's because they've got the food there, and they've also got the habitat, the structure in which to hide away from their predators. You get a lot more biodiversity, just simply because of the complexity of the mussel bed and the huge amount of productivity there is because of the mussels. And some recent work also shows that we've done recently shows the mussels are very important in terms of nutrient cycling, especially taking excess nitrogen out of the water and releasing it as nitrogen gas, which is particularly important in the New Zealand coastal environment where we're putting a lot of nitrogen back in there as a result of excessive fertilisation of pastoral lands. And somewhere like the Waihau River, there's truckloads of nitrogen fertiliser effectively being dumped in the river every month as a result of nitrogen leaching off the farmland. So it was estimated that before the 1950s, with mussel production, with the mussels on the seafloor, we were producing around 16,000 tonnes of small fish a year from the mussel beds, and currently the estimates from the remaining mussel beds are around 20 tonnes of small fish a year. So you can see the massive potential impact that removing those mussel beds have had on the whole ecosystem, especially the fisheries that many of us are interested often in fishing and using. Here's some pictures. I have to thank Sean Lee, who's done a great job in terms of helping Revive Our Gulf, which is the community group which has established to try and put some of these mussel beds back in the Hauraki Gulf. And he's taken many of the pictures for this talk, and so thanks very much, Sean. But this is just an example, and you saw it with Steve and Riley in video form, but 2 glasses of muddy water. You add a mussel to one, and very quickly they clear the water. Mussels are incredibly capable of filtering very efficiently seawater. So putting mussels back have the potential to help us remove some of that sediment out of the seawater, but also just by forming a mat on the seafloor, they help to stabilise the seafloor sediments so we get less of the resuspension of sediment from that muddy seafloor I showed before. So Revive Our Gulf has been accessing mussels from mussel farms and taking them and putting them out to form new beds. And that's given us an opportunity as scientists to have a look and try and understand how the process is working, and also start to understand how these mussel beds work. So this is a mussel barge from Coromandel that's come over to the back of Waiheke, that rat-infested place. And it's lifted up a ton of mussels, and this is just a ton of mussels just being dropped to the seafloor. And when they get to the seafloor, you think of mussels as being inert creatures, but they're actually, adult mussels are quite mobile. They'll crawl along the seafloor for metres, looking to find other adults to join up with and to make a bed. And so it doesn't matter how we throw them down, they'll organise themselves on the seafloor back into a functioning mussel bed, which they cast out threads and they stick to one another. And basically, like joining hands, they make strong of many, and that's the basis of a mussel bed. So Revive Our Gulf has done an amazing job of putting around 10 million mussels in the last 6 years. That's over 120 tonnes of mussel. That's a lot of mussels. Nearly 16 rugby fields in area, but to get it back to what it was, we've got a lot more work to do. So one of the concerns we had with the mussels was that if we put them into areas with very high sediment rates, that they may not survive, they may just get choked. So working with Revive Our Gulf, we did an experiment where we created mussel beds in the Maharangi. And the Maharangi is quite good because you've got a series of habitats where the amount of sediment in the water is very high up here near the mouth of the Maharangi River and going right out into Kowal Bay, where it's a lot cleaner. So we basically created a whole series of mussel beds through that area and then looked at how well the mussels did. And I'm pleased to say they did very well regardless of the amount of sediment loading that they had. Some of the problems we've had, large starfish are the first to arrive on the scene when mussels go down. They love eating mussels. And I think part of the problem is that we have altered the whole ecosystem into a new steady state, if you like, where there's these large starfish that are roaming around looking for anything to eat, and you dump a load of mussels in there, and it's like, it's like taking mussels to your laundry factory on a Friday night with beers. Everyone's into it, and so the starfish just move into those areas very quickly. And what we've found is if we remove the starfish from the beds, we don't continue to get recruitment. So the starfish are obviously moving in from the surrounding areas, and we're basically, by removing them, we've removed them out of the ecosystem. Excellent. Where the mussels are clearing the water, they're filtering vigorously, and we're finding that they're removing the sediment and depositing it around the bed and stabilising it, and that's allowing breakdown of a lot of the organic content as well. And so we're starting to see the biodiversity building up as a result. We're seeing communities growing almost immediately. So this creature here is a sea cucumber. Sea cucumbers are very important in the marine environment for crawling around, and they're like the vacuum cleaners of the sea. They eat up all the rubbish that's left on the seafloor. We're seeing the fish nurseries, and you saw that great footage from Steve of the baby fish in amongst the mussels. And so I guess the message is that it's very easy for us to harvest out an ecosystem and destroy it. But to put it back again is a lot of hard work, and we're not only fighting the cost of doing it, but also just the biological inertia of going from one steady state back to push it back to what it was. But the benefits are there. Living mussel reefs, we're finding that we can establish mussel beds. We're seeing the biodiversity coming back. There's obvious ecosystem benefits in terms of juvenile fishes and recruitment of fishes. That's creating fisheries benefits, and that ultimately must lead to economic benefits as well in terms of enhancing fisheries. And I think the message is great. What's not to love about restoring mussel beds? Thanks.